Welcome to Shadow of Truth, The Fatal Fall, uncovering the truth behind a deadly staircase accident full episode, The Mysterious Fall. Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and don't forget to leave a comment below. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Hit the bell to stay updated on every dark twist and turn we uncover. Now let's get into it. It was the early hours of the morning when Allison Davis heard the terrifying call that would change her life forever. The call was brief, but it carried the weight of an unspeakable tragedy. Her husband, Kevin Davis, had fallen down the stairs. At 4 a.m., she called her best friend, Casey Clem, in a panic. Kevin had fallen, Allison said, her voice shaking with a mix of shock and disbelief. He's on his way to the hospital. Within moments, Casey dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. She arrived just in time to watch Allison crumble into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The prognosis was grim. Kevin was brain dead. Back at the scene, things were less clear. When police arrived at the house in New Haven, Indiana, they found Allison standing in the front yard, motioning for them to come closer. A wave of uncertainty washed over the officers as they approached, unsure of what they were about to witness. Detective James Kruger and Officer Shane Brook arrived, their lights flashing in the dim morning air. Allison calmly pointed them toward the house. "Through the kitchen," she said. As they entered, a grim sight greeted them. Lying face down by the front door, Kevin's body was surrounded by a pool of blood that seemed too much for an ordinary fall. It was everywhere, staining the floor, his clothes, and even the walls. Yet, despite the large amount of blood, there was no clear sign of injury on his head, no lacerations, no abrasions, nothing. No abrasions. Nothing that could explain the severity of his condition. "What happened?" Officer Shane Brook asked as he surveyed the scene. Allison, already trembling with grief, remained calm but distant. "I don't know," Allison replied softly. "We were drinking at the East Haven Tavern, and when we came home, he must have tripped down the stairs." Detective Kruger stepped forward to assess the situation, his mind already working overtime. "We need to search the house," he said, turning to Allison. She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. "I'll cooperate," she said, signing a consent form without hesitation. Inside the home, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The TV was on, a couple of empty beer cans lay scattered on the coffee table. The blanket and pillow on the couch suggested that someone had been napping there, but nothing seemed out of place. No signs of a violent altercation, nothing that screamed foul play. Just an ordinary night gone horribly wrong. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Casey was sitting next to Allison as she tried to process the events of the morning. The two women were close, best friends since childhood, and Casey's concern for her friend was growing by the second. She could see the terror in Allison's eyes, but something felt off. The calmness in Allison's demeanor didn't match the level of devastation one would expect from someone whose spouse had just been critically injured. As Casey comforted Allison, she noticed something strange. There was blood on Allison's fingernail cuticles and on her phone. She had been crying, but Casey couldn't shake the feeling that Allison wasn't quite reacting as expected. Was she in shock, or was there something more to the story? Back at the house, Detective Kruger was still trying to make sense of the scene. The large amount of blood didn't add up to a simple fall. He had seen his fair share of accidents, but this was different. The way Kevin's body had landed, face down, in a perfect position, didn't fit the typical pattern of a fall from the stairs. "This doesn't look right," Kruger muttered under his breath, his mind racing. There were too many inconsistencies, too many things that didn't make sense. But for now, all they had were questions. As the day dragged on, the evidence at the hospital began to paint an even murkier picture. Allison's emotions fluctuated between utter despair and complete calmness. It was almost as if she were waiting for something, but what? When Kevin's life support was disconnected, Allison remained at his side, holding his hand as the machines flatlined. She wasn't crying, she wasn't even speaking, she was eerily composed. "Do you think she's hiding something?" Casey asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. She had known Allison for years, but something felt off. "I don't know," Allison's friend replied, her gaze fixed on her friend. "I want to believe her, but something doesn't add up," Casey finished. "Exactly." As more time passed, Detective Kruger couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more he looked at the scene, the more questions arose. Why was there so much blood? Why didn't Kevin have any obvious head injuries? And why was Allison acting so strangely? Despite all these suspicions, the case was ruled an accident, but Detective Kruger wasn't convinced. He knew the investigation wasn't over, and his instincts told him there was more to this tragedy than met the eye. As the investigation continued, new clues began to surface, clues that would eventually change everything. The shocking truth unravels. Days passed, but for Detective James Kruger, the unease in his gut only grew stronger. The scene at the Davis house, what had appeared to be a tragic accident, was beginning to look more and more like something far more sinister. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, each one revealing a darker picture. It had been a routine night. Kevin and Allison had gone out drinking at the East Haven Tavern, a regular haunt for the couple. The regulars there described Kevin as a friendly, gregarious man, always up for a laugh. Allison, always the supportive wife, was by his side. The two were inseparable, laughing, drinking, and enjoying the night just like they had countless times before. But something had gone terribly wrong when they returned home. When Allison called 911, the dispatcher heard a woman in distress, but it wasn't the frantic, panicked call that you'd expect from a spouse in such a tragic moment. She wasn't screaming, begging for help. She wasn't urgently pleading for the paramedics to hurry. Instead, Allison's voice was calm, almost too calm. This wasn't the reaction the officers had expected. It raised an immediate red flag in Kruger's mind. Was she hiding something? Was the fall really just an accident? Or had something darker happened behind closed doors? Back at the crime scene, the police were trying to piece together what had happened. Kevin's body was found face down at the bottom of the stairs, his head surrounded by a massive pool of blood. Yet, despite the large volume of blood, the cause of his injuries wasn't immediately apparent. There were no visible head wounds, no deep cuts, and no obvious signs of trauma that could explain the blood loss. Something didn't add up. Detective Kruger thought back to Allison's statement. She had claimed that Kevin had fallen down the stairs after they had returned home, but that explanation was too simple, too clean. The scene didn't match her story. With Allison's consent, Kruger and his team began searching the house, looking for anything that might help explain what had happened. There was nothing unusual in the living room, just a blanket, a pillow, and the remnants of the evening, beer cans and a turned TV. But one thing stood out. The dog, Willow, was locked in a bedroom upstairs, growling at anyone who tried to approach. Kruger wondered if that was more than just a coincidence. As they continued their search, the detective's suspicions grew. The blood was everywhere, but there was one thing that struck him as odd: the position of Kevin's body. Had he really fallen down the stairs, or had someone moved him? 3 days later, at the hospital, the truth began to reveal itself. After the autopsy, the coroner's report stunned everyone. Kevin's skull had been crushed in, multiple fractures all over his head. There were no signs of a fall, no bruising or cuts on the outside of his head that would indicate an accident. Kevin had been beaten. The initial belief that this was just a fall down the stairs was now completely thrown out the window. This wasn't an accident. Kevin's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, a violent attack, not a fall. Detective Kruger immediately reclassified the case as a homicide. Now, the question wasn't if someone had killed Kevin, it was who. And all evidence pointed to one person: Allison. Allison's behavior, as more was uncovered, was puzzling. During the investigation, she had been completely cooperative, even allowing police to search the house. But her calmness was starting to seem more like a facade. Was she in shock, or was she hiding something? Her reaction to Kevin's death had raised more questions. In the hospital waiting room, Casey Clem, her best friend, could barely contain her concern. Allison wasn't crying the way one might expect from a wife who had just lost her husband. She wasn't panicked. She was eerily composed. And, as Casey had noted, there was blood on Allison's fingernails and on her phone, odd details that only made the situation feel more sinister. But when Allison returned home after Kevin's death, she appeared calm once again, even as she began the process of cleaning up the horrific crime scene. Cleaning up blood was never something anyone should do, let alone a widow who had just lost her husband in such a violent way. But Allison's calmness continued to strike people as unsettling. Why wasn't she showing more emotion? Why wasn't she grieving? Then there was the 911 call. The dispatch audio was reviewed carefully, and it raised even more questions. Allison's response to the dispatcher didn't sound like someone who had just found their husband lying in a pool of blood. It was as if she was reading from a script, acting instead of reacting, and as the officers listened, they noticed something even more disturbing. Allison had never asked for help. She hadn't rushed to the scene. She hadn't begged the dispatcher to hurry up. Most 911 calls in such situations are frantic. People scream, plead, beg for help. Allison didn't do that. She simply told them what had happened, and then she waited. That silence in the call seemed intentional. As Detective Kruger pieced everything together, he realized that the evidence was mounting against Allison. Kevin's death was no accident. He had been beaten. And the more Kruger thought about it, the more it seemed likely that Allison had been the one to deliver those fatal blows. But even with all the signs pointing to Allison, there was still no murder weapon, no clear physical evidence that definitively tied her to the crime. It was circumstantial, but it was powerful. As the investigation progressed, the community began to turn on Allison. The East Haven Tavern, where she and Kevin had been regulars, became ground zero for gossip. Friends and patrons who had known them both began to question everything they thought they knew about the couple. "There's no way she could have done it," one regular said, defending Allison. "She loved Kevin too much." But the detective wasn't so sure. The growing inconsistencies in Allison's story, her calm demeanor, her changing details, the lack of any emotional response, began to paint a picture of someone who might have known exactly what she was doing. The trial for justice. The courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was palpable. Allison Davis, once a beloved member of the New Haven community, was now standing trial for the murder of her husband Kevin. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A life was on the line, and the question of guilt or innocence was about to be decided. Detective James Kruger sat at the back of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the woman who had once seemed so innocent, so calm in the face of tragedy. The prosecution had presented its case, the evidence against Allison overwhelming. There was no doubt that Kevin had been brutally beaten. His skull had been crushed from multiple blows to the head, blows that were not consistent with a fall down the stairs. The defense, however, had a different story. Allison's attorneys maintained that the evidence was inconclusive. There was no murder weapon. There was no definitive proof that Allison was the one who had delivered the fatal blows. In their eyes, it was still an accident, a tragic, unfortunate accident that had been blown out of proportion. The trial had been long and grueling, but now the time had come for closing arguments. The jury was ready to hear the final word, and the courtroom held its breath. The prosecution's closing argument was strong and unyielding. Prosecutor Tessa Helga stood before the jury, her voice steady but filled with conviction. She spoke of the brutal injuries Kevin had sustained, the fractured skull, the bruising, and the internal bleeding. This wasn't an accident. It was a crime, and the evidence pointed to one person, Allison. "We know that Kevin Davis was not the victim of a fall," Helga said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. His injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma, multiple blows to the head. There was no fall. There was no accident. This was a deliberate act of violence, and the only person who had the opportunity to carry out that violence was his wife. Helga continued, laying out the timeline of events. Allison's calm demeanor, her strange lack of emotion, and the inconsistencies in her statements. Allison didn't act like someone who had just lost the love of her life. She didn't show the panic or grief one would expect from a spouse in that situation. Instead, she cooperated with the investigation, but only because she knew she could control the narrative. She knew exactly what had happened, and she was trying to cover her tracks. But Allison's defense attorneys weren't backing down. They presented their own closing argument, a final plea for the jury to consider the possibility that Allison had simply been in shock. They argued that the absence of a murder weapon and the lack of direct evidence tying Allison to the crime left room for doubt. None of the evidence presented conclusively proves that Allison killed Kevin, one of her attorneys, Max Wiley, argued. There's no weapon, no fingerprints, no smoking gun, only circumstantial evidence. Yes, the fall was tragic, and yes, Kevin's injuries were severe, but that doesn't mean Allison did it. She loved her husband. She wasn't capable of such violence. She's been through enough, losing him, dealing with the aftermath, and now facing this trial. Wiley spoke of the pain Allison had experienced, the life she had lost, and how she had supported Kevin through thick and thin. Allison Davis is not a killer. She didn't murder her husband. This is a tragedy, yes. But it was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. The jury deliberated for hours. The tension in the courtroom grew with each passing minute. Outside, friends and family gathered, anxiously awaiting the verdict. Some believed Allison was innocent, convinced that she had been wrongly accused. Others, however, were certain that justice would be served. For Detective Kruger, the waiting was agonizing. He had spent countless hours on this case, piecing together the evidence, uncovering the lies, and trying to make sense of what had happened. He believed with all his heart that Allison had killed Kevin. But would the jury agree? Finally, at 11 p.m., the jury returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the news. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge said, his voice solemn, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded, holding up a piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Allison Davis, not guilty of the murder of Kevin Davis." Gasps filled the room. Some were in shock, others in tears. Allison's family erupted into a mixture of relief and disbelief. Allison herself looked stunned, unable to process the reality of the moment. For a brief moment, she seemed frozen in time. But as the realization set in, her face broke into tears of joy, and she was embraced by her attorneys. Her father, Steve Davis, was the first to reach her, his arms wrapping around her as he whispered words of comfort. "It's over. You're free," he said, his voice breaking. But for Kevin's family, the verdict was nothing short of devastating. Kevin's mother, Alta Beers, sat in the front row, her face pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. She had fought for justice, but in the end, the jury had decided that Allison was innocent. "I don't know how to feel," Alta said quietly as she left the courtroom. "I just want to remember my son, but it's hard when I feel like he's been forgotten." As Allison was led out of the courtroom, her family and friends swarmed around her. It was a bittersweet celebration. For some, a moment of relief. For others, it was a painful reminder that the truth, whatever it may be, would never be fully known. Allison's defense team, particularly Andrew Baldwin and Max Wiley, were pleased with the verdict. They had fought hard to ensure that their client received a fair trial, and now she was free to rebuild her life. "Allison was always innocent," Baldwin said, his voice filled with pride, "and now she's been given the chance to move on." In the days that followed, Allison was released from jail. She walked out of the Allen County Jail with her parents by her side, and the waiting crowd cheered. Allison's supporters hailed the verdict as a victory, while her detractors remained unconvinced. "I'm just glad it's over," Allison said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've lost so much, and now I can try to start over." But the questions remained. Was Allison truly innocent, or had the jury gotten it wrong? The trial had been a battle of conflicting theories, expert testimony, and circumstantial evidence. In the end, the jury had made its decision, a decision that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. As for Detective Kruger, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, and followed the twists and turns of the case. But in his gut, he knew that the truth still lingered in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more true crime stories, as we continue to explore the cases that leave us questioning everything.